Hey YouTubers, we're gonna go over some newly developed nations, mostly in Africa during this video, and kind of look at some of the big trends that have occurred since decolonization in Africa. So we're going to look at three major places in Africa. We're going to start in the north with Egypt. We're going to go down to Ghana in West Africa, and then we'll move to South Africa and talk about Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So let's start with basic trends in decolonization in Africa. So Africa has faced, and again, it's difficult to characterize all of Africa as having any similar problems because Africa is ginormous. And so saying that Africa has had issues since decolonization is somewhat problematic because there have been many different trends, and Africa is not similar all across the region. We have major differences ethnically, linguistically, economically, and then developmentally as far as politics go. But we can kind of point to some case studies and see out of the 50 some odd countries in Africa that have been recently independent of their colonizers from Europe, many of them have experienced some of the same issues. So some of the generic issues that newly formed African nations have faced since they're getting their independence in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is having to deal with a emerging industrialism development in the country. They've been having to deal with massive poverty, population explosions, lack of adequate health care, social issues that involve ethnic violence, because nations were kind of made by the European powers that came in and just kind of divided up the countries. When they left many different tribal and ethnic groups to kind of fight for power within their newly formed nation. So this has been an issue, and as a result, authoritarian dictatorships, mostly supported by military powers, have been very common. So that was somewhat the case in Egypt. So we'll talk about Egypt. Egypt was of particular focus for the Europeans, especially the British, because of the Suez Canal and its strategic geopolitical location. So when Egypt had been independent since after World War I, but they were basically still controlled by the Europeans until after World War II, when Nasser took power. Gamal Abdul Nasser, I believe is his full name. So Nasser took power with the support of the military and started to implement some broad social changes to try and economic changes in order to try to stimulate the Egyptian economy and Egyptian industrialization and limit the amount of foreign control. So basically tried to keep Egypt out of the hands of their former colonizers. This didn't please everybody. It definitely didn't please the West. And during this Cold War period, if it pleased anybody, it would have probably been USSR, because these changes appeared to be very socialistic and almost communistic. But most of the reforms didn't work out because they were not financed well enough. It was too much of a burden on the peasants. And so after Nasser, Anwar Sadat came to power, and Anwar Sadat was much more in favor of allowing outside investment. So this made the United States very happy, and the West very happy, because it allowed them to again use Egyptian resources by investing their capital in order to advance their own economies. Anwar Sadat ruled until the 80s, the early 80s. He was assassinated by forces which saw him as kind of bowing to Western pressures. And since then, Hosni Mubarak took his place, and Hosni Mubarak basically ruled with military power and lack of social programs while allowing foreign investment. So we've seen this recent trend, the Arab Spring, which is probably too recent for you to worry about in the AP class. I don't see there being any questions on the Arab Spring, but this has been an attempt of more democratization of the Middle East and North Africa in particular. And so Egypt was one of the first places in this Arab Spring, which really has seen a movement more toward a constitutional government and democratization. So moving to West Africa and the country of Ghana, Ghana has gone through a pattern which a lot of other nations have seen as well. An authoritarian, very charismatic, and kind of a native African leader who has promised a lot of changes and a lot of good and development for the country and social programs to help the people, and has not been able to fulfill on those promises, and instead has acted with relative inexperience, reliance on authority, and repression in order to kind of push forward his own advances. So Kwame Nkrumah represents one of these leaders, and again, he was very well intentioned, but due to lack of experience and lack of resources and other overwhelming problems with underdevelopment that these nations face because they're former colonies, was largely unsuccessful. And so what took place after he was ousted from power was more of a military regime. And we've seen these military regimes spring up in a lot of places in Africa, including Uganda, where Idi Amin basically terrorized the nation while he was in power, and was fairly well supported from the West in terms of weapons and financial support. So these authoritarian regimes were kind of okayed as long as they allowed outside support. In South Africa, we had a much different case. In South Africa, there was still a large contingency of white South Africans when South Africa got its independence, and these Afrikaners, as they're known, were descendants of the Dutch or the British who colonized South Africa and maintained their hold of power, political power and social power in South Africa. They created homelands for the ethnic Africans in South Africa. These were basically what in the United States we might think of as reservations for Native Americans that were created. These homelands were small areas carved out and given to native tribal groups, and the whites maintained their stranglehold on power. And this apartheid, this legal segregation, occurred throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s until finally world pressure and growing social unrest led to changes. President de Klerk at the time finally announced the free and legal elections, which would allow all blacks in South Africa to vote for the first time and to run for office. Nelson Mandela, who had been a political protester in the 1960s, who was jailed and spent almost 3 decades in jail for his activities against the Afrikaner-controlled government, was finally released, ran for president, and in 1994 won the presidency. And so the last 20 years for South Africa has been adjusting to this new pseudo-integrated society where there's still obviously racial issues that are present. So those are 3 very different places in Africa and what they experienced after colonization. It's impossible for us to go through every single African nation and talk about all of the different types of unrest and problems that they've experienced, but suffice it to say, many African nations have dealt with lack of development, lack of political leadership or democracy, and lack of social progress or rights for the people. So that's kind of our Africa in a nutshell with some basic vocabulary in there. Be awesome. AP test is not too far away, so I hope you're studying that old stuff too. You can feel free to go back through all these old videos if you really want to bore yourself. Have a good night. Be awesome.